Welcome back to my ranking of the periods of Roman history. We have dealt with classical Rome in the previous video, so now it's time to cover the rest. Same as before, I'm going to give a rating from 1 to 10 of how interesting and popular each time period is in my opinion, and also of how powerful the Roman state was at the time. This isn't some academically approved periodization, just something I came up with trying to split Roman history into segments. We still have 150 years of Western Empire surviving before we get into all that Eastern Roman Byzantine stuff. So without further ado, let's begin. First, we need to cover the legacy of Constantine. One of the most important people in history has left the empire in a more or less stable state. However, he had also devised one of the most ridiculous succession plans ever, so the story of his dynasty is all about murdering each other. Reading about this time and knowing what's to come in the next century, you can't help but feel that this was all a big waste of time. The empire didn't fully exercise its 3rd century demons, but the Constantinians acted like they ruled the whole world. The Christianization of the empire happened sort of in the background. The only real pushback against it is the reign of Julian, and it looks just as some peculiar aberration in the grand scheme of things. 25 years after Julian's death, we have a bishop dictating imperial policy, so the Christianization was pretty much a done deal by that point. The book Christendom by Peter Heather has a very detailed account on how Christianity developed into the Roman religion. I don't think there are many people who think that this period is especially interesting, except maybe Julian fanboys. Sure, Ammianus Marcellinus is a very good historian, but he only covers 25 years. There are some big events like the Battle of Adrianople, but those are few and far between. For my taste, the 4th century is less exciting than the 3rd and the 5th, so it doesn't rank highly on this list. Roman history of the 5th century is interesting in that the more you learn about it, the less you buy into the hype around the fall of the West. Still, the dissolution of the Roman government in the western provinces was the defining event of the century, so it's fair to use it as the name of the time period. This is also an era that is popular for all the wrong reasons. The narrative of the Great Fall of Rome has been ingrained so deeply in the popular imagination that it became every talking head's trick to bash the next bad thing while sounding vaguely educated. Whether it's Christianity, immigration, climate change, or not joining the hostels university, odds are there is someone in the media who claims it as the reason that Rome fell. But those who are interested in actual history rather than demagoguery can still enjoy learning about numerous controversial and colorful figures of the 5th century Roman world. There is the Theodosian dynasty with its impressive women and less impressive men, talented generals like Stilicho and Aetius, and legendary barbarian leaders like Alaric, Gaiseric, and Attila. Most of the narratives are focused around the western part and its eventual demise. The Eastern Empire suffers from many of the same problems, but manages to overcome them and recover in the following decades. The crisis and eventual recovery of the East doesn't sound as cool as the fall of the West, so we can forgive modern historians for giving more attention to the events in the western provinces. However, I would put the end of this time period not at 476, but at 491, the death of Emperor Zeno. Unlike his western counterparts, Zeno had come out on top in his struggle for power against Germanic generals, so we get to enjoy another 1,000 years of Roman history centered around Constantinople. The best book I've read lately about this time is Peter Heather's The Fall of the Roman Empire. It has the same issue of being too Western-centric for my taste, but it is a good place to start if you want to learn about these events. It will help you get a clearer view and no longer fall for stupid cliches about this most misunderstood period in Roman history. The 5th century isn't one of my favorites, but I get why people like it, so I am giving it a decent 7 out of 10. The popularity of this era is owed primarily to one man, Justinian. Of the Eastern Roman emperors, he is the most well-known, and this mosaic of him is basically a synonym for the word Byzantium. Whether or not you agree that Justinian was the Great, you can't deny that he is great to read about. Procopius has a very entertaining writing style, and would easily make it into any list of the best ancient historians. The court intrigues of Theodora and the wars of Belisarius really come to life on the pages of his books. After Procopius dies, there is no historian of his caliber for quite a while, so even if Justinian's successors were as fascinating as he was, we'd have a harder time grasping that. But they were not. Justin II, Tiberius II, and Maurice are interesting in their own right, but they lack a grandeur of ambition that Justinian had. And they also lack the money to dream as big because Justinian had spent it all, so it's probably for the best that they weren't as ambitious as he was. The second big highlight of this time is the last Persian War. It's a completely different story. Instead of trying to restore the former glory, the Romans are fighting for survival. In a typical Roman fashion, Heraclius takes the empire to the brink of destruction, just to pull it back out at the last second through sheer determination and a decent bit of luck. His Persian expeditions are some of the most impressive military feats in the entire Roman history. I've already sung enough praises to the writings of Procopius, so I suggest you check him first if you want to get more familiar with the 6th century Roman Empire. To cover the second big event of this period, I'd recommend you to pick up a newer entry, The Last Great War of Antiquity by James Howard-Johnston. It is by far the most complete, analytical, and informative book out of all that cover this topic. Justinian and Heraclius are both very well known, so it makes sense to me to rank this one highly on the popularity scale. These decades have some of the highest highs and the lowest lows, so I would say that this popularity is well earned. And here we go from the more famous historical period to one of the most obscure. The Heraclians, past the dynasty's founder, are largely ignored in popular Byzantine narratives. Reason why is very simple. The primary sources are not that good. The monks who wrote them didn't have a particularly good writing style and produced very dry chronicles. Sometimes they contradict each other and are generally very inconsistent. Going from Procopius to Theophanes the Confessor feels like a huge downgrade. Another reason for this era's unpopularity is that it doesn't fit anywhere. It's neither classical Roman nor medieval Byzantine. The empire of Constans II looks really weird from whichever angle you look at it. As a transitional period from classical to medieval Roman Empire, this period doesn't appeal to the fans of either, and the fact that it is mostly about losing doesn't exactly help the popularity. The coolest thing coming from this period are the adventures of Justinian II, the guy with one of the biggest main character complexes in Roman history. His exploits bring some much-needed spice into an otherwise bland narrative of the 7th century decline. As I've said, the original sources aren't all that good, but luckily we have modern academics whose job is to dig through them and try to construct a coherent narrative. The best product of these efforts is John Haldon's book, The Empire That Would Not Die. I wish we knew more about the period, but as of today, our knowledge of the 7th century Roman Empire is just not enough for a wide appeal, so it gets a relatively low score from me. I remember learning about the Iconoclasm for the first time very well. The History of Byzantium by late great John Julius Norwich describes this event quite dramatically. I had a very clear image in my head of a grim procession to the Chalk Gate, with Emperor Leo determined to cast down the graven images, and the people of Constantinople looking with anger and confusion on the soldiers who were removing the icon of Christ from the gate. A century of religious violence followed, countless works of art were destroyed, and many faithful Orthodox persecuted for their beliefs. Or so we used to think. Today, a lot of old conceptions about the iconoclasm are being questioned. It's now believed to be much more tame than what we have imagined. The way we used to think about the iconoclast emperors and the movement as a whole is being reassessed to separate fact from slander. But the titular religious movement is not why I think that this period is very underappreciated. It's kind of the opposite. The religious narrative used to drown out the actual personalities and deeds of this century's emperors. Now that we can look at those events without the anti-iconoclast bias, we can better appreciate the victories of Constantine V, the reforms of Nicephorus I, and the marvelous automatons of Theophilos. There is certainly more to the 8th century Byzantium than just obsession with religious matters. However, the academic findings are slow to make their way into popular knowledge, so this period still remains largely unknown. There are no popular history books that focus on this time frame. A good place to get a more updated view is Byzantium in the Iconoclast Era by Leslie Brubacker and John Haldon, but you should be ready to read through scholarly analysis, because it's very far from your average pop history. This time period is the foundation on which the Byzantine reconquests of the later centuries were built. It may not be popular right now, but I expect this situation to change in the future. I give it a solid 8 for how interesting it is. After 2 long centuries of setbacks and beatdowns, the empire is ready to strike back big time. The Romans are taking full advantage of the Abbasid decline, making it the most triumphant period in Eastern Roman history. This is classic Byzantium. Obstinate priests and cunning generals act out their parts against the backdrop of the capital splendor and the dangerous frontiers. Starting with Michael III, every imperial generation has a unique story which never feels dull. The new military elite of the empire is so competitive and filled with ambitious men that it feels a lot like the late Roman Republic. Some neighboring rulers even willed their kingdoms to the empire, just like the king of Pergamon in the glorious days of old. The Roman state rises to the heights of power unseen since the 6th century, only to become complacent once again and squander it all in a matter of decades. For you reading people out there, I will recommend Streams of Gold, Rivers of Blood by Anthony Kaldellis. It reveals in great detail how this new glory was won and how it all fell apart. The Middle Byzantine period is a popular one, and deservingly so. There is enough to entertain a fan of any kind of history. The Roman Empire has a strong military, a full treasury, and a flourishing culture. The old seats of power and ancient holy relics are being reclaimed, and even the internal squabbles don't hamper the reconquests. The only thing keeping this one down in the interest department is a lack of real rivals. The triple trouble troop of Normans, Pechenegs and Seljuks only appears later in the period, and until the very end seems to be a relatively small nuisance. For this reason, the Macedonian era stops short of getting the title of the most interesting period of Eastern Roman history. Okay, this one is actually my favorite. The post-Manzikert chaos feels very similar to the 3rd century crisis, only this time the empire is nowhere as dominant as it was back then. Fresh off his career as strategos, Alexios Komnenos burst on the scene and changed the whole game. He stopped the empire from falling apart and did his best to present an image of strength regardless of the state's actual military capabilities. And most importantly, he initiated the movement that defined this era, the Crusades. For a reader of Byzantine history, it now becomes very important to understand the politics of Western Europe. Back in the Macedonian era, you could get away with only knowing a few key names, but now it becomes impossible to follow the dynamics of diplomacy without a solid understanding of what's going on with the Catholics. The primary sources for this period are also great. John II isn't that well covered, but both Alexios and Manuel have extensive and very entertaining histories written about them. The Alexiad and the histories of Nikitas Choniatis are an absolute joy to read if you like some medieval drama. The biography of Alexios Komnenos might as well have been a fun Crusader Kings campaign. It's also a decently popular period, primarily because of the Crusades, but I think it deserves more attention than just being a backdrop for the armed pilgrimages of the Latin Knights. It's quite unique in its synthesis of the Roman imperial gravitas with the spirit of high medieval adventure. Only during the Komnenoi Era do you get jousting tournaments, trebuchets, and getting a spear wound in the butt in the framework of Roman imperial history. For the most relatable of protagonists and the most diabolical of villains, I am giving this time period my highest rating out of the whole bunch. That whole Crusade situation didn't pan out well for the empire, did it? The collapse of the Komnenian system and a bunch of very stupid decisions led to the sack of Constantinople and the destruction of Roman imperial authority. The next 57 years were spent trying to rebuild it. This is the most Game of Thrones-like time in the wider Roman history. A feast for the crows on the corpse of the once mighty empire. The successor states of Trebizond, Epirus and Nicaea all take a turn at being the favorite to retake Constantinople, duking it out with the Crusaders, the Seljuks and the Bulgarians. It is also the time when a coherent narrative is the hardest to reconstruct, with at least 3 major plot lines and a bunch of minor ones. Much like a novice Game of Thrones viewer, you may struggle to keep track of all of the characters. The only way to grasp what's happening is to look at the big picture that involves all of the regional players. As the eventual victor, Nicaea gets at least some recognition, but the stories of Epirus and Trebizond are only familiar to the Eastern Roman history superfans. The Chronicle of George Acropolites is the one I generally use for my references, and it is very much centered on Nicaea. What elevates this period, in my opinion, is the density of memorable characters. In a very George Martin-esque fashion, many of the original cast croak in the first few years, but there are enough new characters to fill their spots. For me, John III and Michael VIII were particularly interesting for completely different reasons. It's really cool to trace the paths that different groups of Eastern Romans take on their road to recapture Constantinople. The Latin Empire turns out to be a big disappointment, but there are still more than enough adversaries for the Byzantines to go around. Overall, it's a completely different time than anything you've experienced in Roman history beforehand. There is still a lingering bitterness from the events of 1204, but there is also a well-defined goal, which makes for a captivating story of 3 different actors taking on the same challenge. And finally, we arrive at the last imperial dynasty. And boy is the spirit good at making people depressed. In the last 2 centuries of Roman history, whenever things look relatively optimistic, you can bet something bad is going to happen very soon. A plague will hit, mercenaries will revolt, or someone is going to start a pointless civil war. I know people like hitting on the Angoloi, but if we list Byzantine dynasties by the time density of blunders and stupid decisions, the Paleologoi may rank even higher than them. The story of Paleologoi is one of wasted opportunities and squandered potential. Don't believe the people who say that Byzantium was doomed to fall in its later centuries. They just underestimate the last imperial dynasty's skill at pissing away every solid chance for a comeback. I'd say it's only at the turn of the 15th century, when the situation becomes untenable and the empire is firmly headed towards being conquered, bar some miraculous outside intervention. And it is a shame really, considering that the last 3 emperors are all very decent. Thanks to them, the Eastern Romans go down swinging, and are remembered as a nation that fought on till the bitter end. There are some good primary sources for these final centuries, like Cantacuzenos and Sphrantzes, but I want to highlight another historian, the one you may least expect to appear in my recommendations. We give a lot of flack to Edward Gibbon, but credit where credit is due. His chapter on the fall of Constantinople is absolutely great. The same way he is responsible for the low reputation of Byzantium in the West, he can also be credited with a good bit of popularity of Constantine XI. If you are looking for a newer entry, you can check out The Last Centuries of Byzantium by Donald M. Nicol. It doesn't have the colorful language of Gibbon, but is of course more updated, and a much better source to learn about the whole of Palaiologos dynasty, and not just its last ruling member. These 2 final centuries are a bittersweet note to end the long history of the Roman state. There may be a lot of blundering and stupid decisions, but there's also a lot of heroism and fighting against the odds. And even though it's kind of hard to get into, understanding the history of the empire's demise should prove worth your while. Now let's recap the whole thing. For me, the Late Republic and the Komnenoi Era are the only 10 out of 10s, the S tier if you'd like. The Punic Wars, the 3rd century crisis, and the Macedonians are the A tier, and the rest are somewhere below. I know everyone has different tastes, but if you like strong character-driven historical narrative, your list would probably look very similar to mine. Of course, you should feel free to share your top picks in the comments below, and tell me why they are superior to what I chose. I'd like to thank my patrons Mulay Shirkawi, Conventus Orbis, Bikimes, and others who are supporting me on Patreon. And for the rest of you, thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you in the next one.